Hello, everyone, and welcome to the penultimate session of eCOTS 2020. My name is John Gabrosic, and I'm from Grand Valley State University and had the pleasure and honor of serving on the eCOTS 2020 Planning Committee. We're pleased to continue the discussion on Wednesday's hot topics with what I like to refer to as our Fab Five presenters today. And that's one more than the Fab Four had. So I want us, we're better than the Beatles. From the panel, Engaging Students During the COVID-19 Health Crisis, we have Laura Lee from University of Minnesota, Carrie Locke Morgan from Penn State University, and I think Lucy's with us now, Lucy McGowan from Wake Forest University. And then from the workshop, Teaching Introductory Statistics and Data Science, we have Maine Chetinkaya Rundell from University of Edinburgh, Duke University, and RStudio, and Ulrike Genschel, my fellow Iowa State graduate student at Iowa. She's also at Iowa State University now. By now, most of you, I'm sure you all know the drill, that please post questions to the question Q&A section. Any comments you want to go to just the panelists, post to the chat to panelists. Anything you want to go to panelists and attendees, post to the chat to panelists and attendees. And the session is being recorded. So I'm going to kind of get things started. And I thought the first question I would start with the COVID-19 group, and maybe we can start with Laura, you kind of kicking us off. And the question was, what's the next thing that you would have wanted to say in your session but didn't have time, or that you thought about after your session and wish you had said more about it?
So I presented on collaborative keys, and I think I would have gone into more flexibility in how collaborative keys can work in your classroom. So I talked with someone afterwards about it and how she uses it, and I was like, oh, that would have been so good. So I presented how I use it, but I have graduate students, and those are different than undergraduate students. So I think I probably would have highlighted how maybe graduate students are different than undergraduate students and how it could be used better for undergraduates.
Okay, how about Lucy? Why don't you add something to that, what you would like to say?
So we talked a little bit at the beginning. I sort of focused on compassionate learning and thinking about how to teach these types of topics in the classroom. And I think it would have been, it's so hard because we had a number of questions that we didn't have time to answer, but there were really good questions in the chat afterwards about kind of thinking about like the types of visualizations that you could do, or maybe even using like analyses that people have already done instead of just having your students do an analysis fresh. And so I think that it would have been nice to have more time to talk about kind of those types of topics as well. And also maybe to spend a little bit of time highlighting how people can contribute. We have this website where we've got all of this information that the three of us compiled on there. And actually Mina just contributed to it yesterday. So we've got some extra things in there too, but I wish we had more time to sort of show how easy it is for other people to contribute, because I think this is a really nice time to crowdsource ideas and sort of not reinvent the wheel, because so many people are trying to figure out how to best incorporate this stuff in the classroom. It's great if we can sort of utilize those skills.
Carrie, would you like to add to that?
Sure. So there was lots more. So we got kind of, we didn't have time to finish the presentation entirely, which was awesome because you guys were so engaged. So thank you. But I didn't get to say what I wanted to about engaging students in a virtual environment. And I think the main plug I wanted to put in right now is for breakout rooms. And I know some of you were on the last discussion and it came up a little bit. But I think breakout rooms are great for engaging students, but I think they're also really crucial right now when students are lacking that peer-to-peer interaction. So I just wanted to say, I'm going to put a link into the chat for how to enable them in Zoom if you want to. And basically, it's something you set up ahead of time, and then once it's enabled in your class, you can just send students to breakout rooms, and Zoom randomizes your class into groups of whatever size you choose, and they have their own little small peer-to-peer discussions, and then they can rejoin the class either when you call them back or when they want to. So I think it's great to have that peer-to-peer engagement when everyone is so disconnected otherwise.
So let's go ahead and turn to the workshop folks on intro stat teaching and data science. I'm going to ask you the same question. What would you have wanted to say or added to? And let's start with Mine.
Great. So I think one of the things that I didn't really get a chance to go into with the time is assessment of the students, and actually how we can make assessment a bit more efficient, because I talked about a lot of components of a course that, and I said, like, I think we should have assignments that enable creativity and get students to bring in like a piece of themselves to it. But I think those things tend to be hard to kind of write a very straightforward rubric for, and can sometimes be harder to give feedback for, especially if you have TAs that are like a little less experienced in the subject. And one of the things I really didn't get a chance to discuss in detail is how we can leverage peer feedback, because it both has the opportunity to kind of like, it multiplies you in terms of the number of people giving feedback, but students really learn from each other. And I think the good practices tend to be contagious and the bad ones not as much. So it's like a good way for students to learn from each other. So it would have been, I would have loved to say a bit more about that.
Ulrike?
So one thing that I did not get to talk about is, well, when you're new to teaching, one experience I made is out of kindness, more or less, because I did not want to embarrass the students when they came to my office hours and they tried to ask me questions. It's very often that you know exactly what question is going to come, but they cannot articulate it very well. And so I always thought, well, I'm going to make them feel better by more or less jumping in and sort of finishing the question for them. And I think that was one of the biggest mistakes I made, because once you let them articulate it and you let them struggle through the articulation, it really becomes more clear of what their understanding is and what not. And when I had students struggle with that, I did explain to them why I want them to try to articulate it on their own. I didn't want to make them feel bad, but I did tell them that it's for their own sake of learning. And this ties all into what I consider, or you probably also have heard of, this idea of expert versus novice, and our students are the novices, and for them everything is new. This idea of how we think as statisticians is something that many of them don't bring to the table. And so talk to your students as much as you can and let them talk as much as you can, because that will give you a lot of feedback of what their current understanding is.
I think that's a really good point. I think that I've always found with my students that the way I'm thinking about a problem and sort of that metacognitive, I'm going to talk through how I think about it, but hearing how they think about it sometimes can be a little bit eye-opening. Almost every time, actually. Let's stay with the intro stat group first, and I'll stay with you, Ulrike. Is there a question that you wished someone had asked you during the presentation that you were kind of, or maybe afterwards you thought, oh, this is a great question, I would ask someone that just gave that presentation?
You're putting me on the spot. I was slightly flustered during this presentation, so what do I wish someone had asked me?
Or maybe just about intro stat teaching in general.
Sort of oh no, that question did come up. Thinking about, oh God.
Or maybe if it's a question that came up, just sort of, maybe you, because probably not everybody here was in that session. Yeah. So maybe if you sort of talk about that a little for us. I
think it's one of the question that keeps be coming up over and over again is the topics. Which topics do you include? Which order do you include the topics into an intro course? And I think that depends really on who your audience is, because for most of us, our audience are students from other disciplines. And so the methods that they need are different depending on discipline. So knowing who your audience is, and if you don't have methods or courses tailored towards audiences like we have at Iowa State, then sort of get an understanding of who's in your class and what kind of methods might they be interested in. And there are these common introductory topics that we start out with, descriptive statistics and general inference. But very often at the end, you might ask yourself, well, am I going to do regression, or do I maybe do more categorical data analysis and something like a chi-square? And so I think it's up to you what you think you will serve the students best.
Maine, you want to go ahead and answer that?
So one of the questions I got after, but kind of privately over email, was how do I, as an instructor, kind of keep my skills up in terms, like my computational skills up, so that I am kind of teaching my students, or both, how do I know what is the types of data sciencey stuff they should be learning at this point, and also how do I skill up? And I think it's a really good question, and there are no easy answers, because the easy out answer is, oh, read everything that's ever said about this topic all the time. And I don't think that's really realistic, especially because for most of us, this is not the only thing we're doing in our lives. But at the same time, I think one of the things that I would say, especially in terms of teaching computing nowadays, is that I think it's very possible that doing certain tasks that are very helpful as preparing your data for it, doing like statistical data analysis, have gotten easier since the first time you may have learned a language like R or Python or something like that. So I think thinking back to this, I think we always know that the way you're solving something in R may not be the only way to do it, but sometimes there's no time to think like what might be the better way. So engaging with others who tend to think about these, and reading about like what are some of the new packages that are coming up that are intro data science friendly that you might want to introduce to your students, might just like narrow the scope down enough that it might be a little bit easier to keep up with, because otherwise it is, I think, very difficult to keep up with the ecosystem. So I thought that that was a nice question that came through that others may have benefited from the answer to.
Yeah, I think that's really, as a baby boomer, and I'm sure you're all of a different generation than I am, the first programming course I ever took was called Fortran 77. So it was in 1977. And that is something that my generation has really struggled with, is the technology moves so fast. How do you find sort of that corpus of things that you say, well, these are really the things I want to invest my time on, so then I can help my students as well. So it's a very interesting question. Let's go ahead and go to the COVID-19 group. And I'm going to ask the same question to them, which is, what's a question that you wish had been asked during your session, but was not? And let's go ahead and start with Carrie this time.
Okay, so I'm also typing some answers in the Q&A too. So if you're asked a question, you could look there as well. But this is such a fun question because there's so many things we could talk about. But I think one question, so I talked a lot about how to bring COVID data into the classroom and data sets that I brought in late March, early April. And I think a fun question would be, what data would you bring in right now if you were teaching? And I think kind of my guiding principle was to bring in data sets that would help guide students' actions. So I talked about social distancing when it was not yet enforced. I talked about hydroxychloroquine when Trump was pushing it as a miracle drug and the evidence was really quite shady. And I talked about cloth masks before they were enforced, but more as they don't really protect you, they protect others. So don't use them as a don't use them in place of other features like social distancing. So I think right now I'd want to talk about the evidence that cloth masks really do help to prevent others. And I don't have the data, but if there were data out there that shows that, I would love to bring that into the classroom right now to help make students wear masks right now.
Lucy, go ahead and add something to that.
Yeah, I think that's really great. And kind of coming up with those questions is also something that is a fun discussion to have. Victoria from McAllister sent me an email, and it was, I thought, really great question about thinking about sort of what topics to include in a class that's already created, how much to sort of shift into the COVID space and how much to kind of keep and in the kind of space that you originally had intended. And it sort of brought up for me thinking about also like if students So part of what we talked about was like polling students and figuring out how much content they want. And I think we sort of frame this in the context of like, see if they want to talk about it. And if they do, then you can talk about it. But we didn't really mention the point of like, what if it's all they want to talk, like what if they just want to talk about this and they almost want to sort of like negate the material that you had initially intended on going through in the class. And I think that's a really interesting question on trying to find the right balance. And so incorporating things that are relevant to what's happening right now while still kind of teaching the concepts that you intended to get across in the classroom. And so that, I don't have necessarily an answer for it, but it is an interesting thing to think about when planning this, that like you can, in addition to sort of incorporating these topics, you know, and seeing if the students want to, there's also a chance that they like really, really want to and expect to get even more than what you really are anticipating putting into the course, and trying to kind of find that, strike that balance appropriately. So.
And Laura, what question did you have?
Maybe like, how can I make this work for my course? Can I contact you? So I love to talk about education, and in my like little plug of like who I am at the start, I love to help other people's make their course better. And so I would love, if you're interested more in collaborative keys, feel free to email me and set up a time on how we can make this work for your course, or brainstorm on ideas on how you can engage students in a virtual environment. I've been teaching online since 2013. So I have learned things along the way on what works and what doesn't work. Yeah, I think that's what I would have liked.
That's one of the things that has always impressed me about the statistics education community, is how willing and open people are to having people contact them, and then they'll share their materials. They'll, you know, contact via email, kind of start a conversation that way. So this one is for the COVID-19 group. And so I actually, on my final exam, every question was a COVID-19 question, except for one. And what I found was, at some point I had to stop the data collection, right? And actually write the questions, and then kind of cross my fingers and say, well, I hope in 2 weeks that this is still what's happening. So my question is, as a teacher, you kind of plan well in advance. You develop your materials, your units for the semester based on kind of currently available information. So with a very rapidly changing topic like COVID-19, how do you make those on-the-fly adjustments efficiently, but still adhere to sort of the newest science? So Lucy, I'm gonna go ahead and let you start.
Yeah, that's a great question, sort of trying to figure out how to incorporate the data as it's emerging. And I think Carrie actually had some good points here, because some of the data that she had incorporated, like there's been more data that's come out since when it came in. And I think I find, I don't know, I'm a very green teacher. I'm new to this, so I'm going to give my perspective, but it might not be the best one. But my approach generally is just to be really honest in the classroom. And so I'll bring in a data set and say, like, this is what it was when I was putting this assignment together. And if something had changed, I might link to an article that would show an update. Or maybe we would have a follow-up assignment, which isn't necessarily helpful for a final exam, but for thinking for fall of 2020, I think that can be sort of an approach to potentially take, especially because I think for sure this stuff is always going to be evolving, and it actually presents a really nice educational opportunity for students, and sort of thinking about how we think about statistical questions, that a lot of times the data, especially in something like a pandemic where it's hard to get clean data, the data is going to be, and the information is going to be constantly evolving. And so sort of just being really honest about that reality, I think is a good thing to do. And even thinking about, you know, if you don't feel comfortable incorporating like actual raw data in the classroom, you could easily incorporate things like how to take an article that's in the media and translate it back to the article that was initially published, or the preprint that was published, and then how to translate that into what was actually really done. And sort of even just that process, I think, can be really helpful for students, because even in a single study, you can see things evolve over time. And so that's, yeah.
Carrie?
Yeah, so I wouldn't recommend this normally. I think it's a bad pedagogical approach, but I found myself this semester having very feverish mornings, like right before the class, because everything was changing so quickly, or even a couple of days before. So I was not prepping weeks in advance for these COVID lectures. And in some cases, I would prep a lecture that really would have fit into the course a couple weeks later, or better a couple weeks later, and then end up just giving it now because, okay, we're going to recommend masks today, or Pennsylvania is going into a stay-at-home order today, and like this is the time that it's relevant. So I think maybe having a little flexibility in when you're talking about it and talking about it right after you make the lectures was my approach, for better or for worse.
Laura, your thoughts?
Can you repeat the question? I was so distracted by my kids.
See, that's what happens. The social distance is not where it needs to be.
No. Can you repeat the question? Sorry.
The question was, as a teacher, you develop materials and units well in advance. But a topic like COVID is changing so rapidly. How do you make those changes you need to on the fly efficiently, but you're still being true to the science?
So I'm thinking about my online class because I teach a lot online, and it's almost like pre-packaged. So we already have the activities in place, and like it goes through a lot of vetting. So I don't actually do a lot on the fly besides maybe pointing something out in like the weekly announcements about like, and I try to make it relevant to the week. So I had mentioned like I didn't do much with COVID in particular just because I was overwhelmed with things. And so, finding something on diagnostic testing in the week that we talked about diagnostic testing, and like having them, look at, use the terminology and the knowledge they used from like the lectures in the textbook to that article. Or, maybe I'll pull up like a graph, and maybe I might have them comment in the Q&A forum. But it'll all be in like weekly announcements or a Q&A forum. Like, here's a graph, like, tell me what do you make of this, or what do you interpret it? So I don't do a whole lot like bringing it into the material for the week, but maybe more of one-off type of things of what I might see that could apply, and try to make it applicable to things that they had already learned or things that we are learning for that week.
So this question's for the Intro Stat Data Science workshop group. And we've got about 8 minutes left. And I want to take the last couple of minutes to sort of get some audience participation. So make your answers kind of short. Although this question could be like an entire panel discussion. So the question is, I think it is fair to say that we often have a dichotomy in intro stats teaching between people that teach in a formula-based method and people that are more data-based. How do we make sure that we don't end up with a trichotomy, formula-based, data-based, data science-based? And maybe I'll let you speak to that.
Well, I guess you asked for a short question, but a short answer, but you asked a very in-depth question. So here's how I'll answer this, and it's really not a cop-out. I've personally never really identified myself with anything that ends with the letters IST. I'm a so-and-soist. I'm, for example, not a Bayesian or a frequentist. I'm a whatever worksian for the problem at hand. And so I think that, hence I don't think there's going to be like this whole other bucket. I do know that right now, as we are trying to think about how do we bring more of the data science that's already so close to and near and dear to our hearts as statisticians into our teaching and give our students the useful skills. I know that this is starting off with their IntroStat courses and their intro data science courses, but I strongly believe that this will somehow take shape in a way where some of the changes from some of the innovations from the intro data science courses will inform how we're teaching our IntroStat courses as well. And similarly, years and years worth of learnings from teaching IntroStat will similarly inform intro data science courses as well, because we statisticians are not the only ones teaching intro data science courses. And if you look at how it's being taught by other departments, the interpretation is very different. I think we're just in a rocky, but in a way like nice rocky, like R&D stage of figuring out what's the right way to deliver this to our students. especially with high school stats changing as well. That I think is going to be the thing that gives us breathing room in our intro stat courses to be able to inject a little bit more of the computing in there so we can get the students started on it. So I think we'll settle into a sweet place. Now, the whole simulation based or not, the nice thing about the computational approaches is they really, really very nicely yield themselves to simulation based methods. So like I love teaching simulation based inference because it actually carries from doing web scraping where you do something over and over again over multiple pages. And so there's links, there's really nice computational links there.
So I'm going to throw a little curveball. I call this moderator's discretion. So this is for the participants, not just for the panelists. So what I want you to do, take a few seconds to think about this question. A colleague asked you, what was the best thing you heard/did at eCOTS? How do you answer that colleague? And what I'm going to steal this idea from Andrew Ross from their presentation. And what he did was he said, type your answer in the chat, but don't hit enter until I count down from 3, 2, 1, and then say the word enter. So everybody take a minute, panelists included, type in what you would say to the question, what was the best thing you heard or did at eCOTS? How do you answer your colleague? Don't hit enter until I tell you to do that. So take a minute to do that. And then as people are doing that, what I'm going to ask the panelists to do once we hit enter is to kind of scroll down real quickly, pick one that you want to read out to everybody. So I'm going to give you about 15 more seconds and then count down. Okay, 3, 2, 1, enter.
There's a lot.
There's a lot. It's awesome to see them come up. So panelists, take a minute to look through those, pick your favorite, and I'm going to start and just go the way you are on my screen, which is Carrie, Maine, Ulrike. Well, actually, I'll start with Lucy because she needs to head out at 1. I'll go Lucy, Carrie, Maine, Ulrike, and Laura.
Okay, so there's so many. I'm literally just gonna like do a scroll and pick one. It's a random distribution. But here's one that says AI grading. Think more about stat data science interface and more about simple visualizations. Thought more about what activities will engage students. That's great, actually. That was a good random one because I also think kind of thinking about how to automate things like grading, which I would love to be able to automate that more. And also thinking about kind of student first pedagogy, I feel like is always a good way to do it.
Carrie, do you have one for us?
Oh, it's really hard to pick. John, you gave us a hard job, but I guess one that I like, and this is not necessarily the best, it's just hard to pick. But I think this is really good. Students don't all need to get the right answer to be engaged in statistics.
Very nice. Maine.
Okay, I'm going to give an answer that's going to sound selfish, but I promise it's not. Somebody mentioned the Preparing to Teach workshop, and I'm very, very happy to see that. And the reason why I'm highlighting it is that I know there are some graduate students on the call right now, and also many of us work with other graduate students, so we are going to continue to offer this workshop. So keep it in your mind that it is a thing that happens, and it's at preparingtoteach.org. So let others know, because I think those who have participated have really enjoyed it.
Ulrike.
I got one here that happens to me every time I participate in our conferences. And there were so many practical, meaningful ideas shared on how to make your stats classes better. I walked away with some really great ideas to implement in my classes. And I think that's the great thing about our conferences.
Yes, yes. Laura.
You stole mine.
Sorry.
I saw the expression on your face and wondered why.
I mean, so I just scrolled up a little farther. Like, I mean, and it really speaks true to me too. I'm just like attending any conference on teaching statistics, just interacting with people and getting ideas on how you can make teaching better. So here's one of great ideas for engaging students in online environment, clickers, collaborative key, this example. So, I mean, I think that just speaks to the heart of the Conference on Teaching Statistics.
Well, I want to thank the Fab Five. They were, as I expected them to be, absolutely fabulous. We have one more Hot Topics session. It's at 1:15. It's the Thursday Hot Topics. They are using a practicum as a cumulative assessment in introductory statistics with Megan Hyman and Eric Reyes from Rose-Hulman Institute, and engaging a diverse audience through online learning with Annalise Sabag, Cal Poly, Rebecca Wong, West Valley College, Beverly Wood, Embry-Riddle Aeronautical University. And thank you all so much for attending eCOTS 2020, and we look forward to seeing you in 15 minutes.